I'm calling this "We Are All Treaty People" because it's a phrase that people have heard, and probably everybody has their own notion of what it means, but it covers a wide scope. So I thought it was appropriate for this. It's also kind of happened to be the case that the first week of November, like the week just passed, was Treaties Recognition Week in Ontario. And it's been Treaties Recognition Week in Ontario since November 2016, which was set up in response also to the Truth and Reconciliation Calls for Action, which called for broad-based education on treaties. So we're doing now a little bit more education on treaties. So what I'm going to talk about is number one, land acknowledgements, which we've all experienced if you've ever gone to the theater or various other places, and what it is that they're trying to do. So the history that is contained in some of the Toronto land acknowledgements that you might have heard. What's a wampum? Touch on the Royal Proclamation. It's the Royal Proclamation of 1763, if I'm to put the date in, and why that still continues to be a big deal in 2024. And also the treaty that we are under in our land at Little Trinity, which may not be the same treaty that you're under if you live in certain parts of Scarborough. Then a little bit about our specific land and neighborhood and how we came to have it, how Little Trinity came to have that land, and what's going on in terms of Indigenous activity in that area today. And hopefully we'll have time to get into the story of our Arthur Eugene O'Meara, who was the nephew of one of our rectors and the brother of another one, and who was an early land advocate. And just, I mean, anyways, I have one slide on him, but I could do a whole long presentation on him. Really interesting guy, who was an early land advocate. And then I did add another slide just this morning as a kind of conclusion of, so what am I supposed to do about this with some of the learning that I have experienced since I went down this road a few years ago for the first time. So acknowledging the land. This is, again, about nations, wampums, treaties, and the Royal Proclamation. So I'm going to show you a few land acknowledgements. The reason I'm doing this is because when we organized as a lunch and learn to have the diocesan educational workshop called Mapping the Ground We Stand On. That was February, I think, by the time we had it. The woman who was leading it said, well, you can start with, whatever your land acknowledgement is. And I had to say, well, we don't have a land acknowledgement at Little Trinity. And then I felt bad about that. And she said, well, you can come up with one. And I thought, no, I don't have the authority to come up with a land acknowledgement for Little Trinity. But I cobbled one together and I learned a lot about what's supposed to be in them in the process of doing that. But it is not an official land acknowledgement. It was just for that day. So I learned a lot about, she sent me some resources and I learned a lot about what a land acknowledgement is supposed to be for, what it's supposed to contain. And I'm going to show you some and we can kind of get some things out of that and then look into it. So this is the official land acknowledgement for the Diocese of Toronto, or that is recommended by the Anglican Diocese of Toronto for parishes to take into consideration when they're developing their own land acknowledgement. And notice how specific it is in terms of the locations that this is an appropriate land acknowledgement for. Do I have any volunteers? Notice that this is the only one where there's a pronunciation guide. Do I have any volunteer to unmute yourself and read it?
The land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabeg nations and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Toronto Purchase. Today, Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island.
Okay. Thanks, Peggy. That's that's fairly standard content for land acknowledgements in Toronto. The diocesan website also suggests that as Christians, we also offer our gratitude for the opportunity to share the land with Indigenous peoples as members of a church has a conflicted history with Indigenous peoples, and we commit ourselves to the ongoing process of reconciliation. And it says you can express this idea by concluding the acknowledgement with something like, we recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples connected to and on this land. We are grateful for the opportunity to gather on this territory and work in this community, and we commit ourselves to the work of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So that's adding not just a kind of recitation of the history, but also a statement of gratitude. And sometimes it is also considered appropriate to personalize the land acknowledgement to your specific location and perhaps the focus of what it is you do. So I'm going to show you another one that was right in my face when I went to buy hiking boots last week. It was on the door of Mountain Equipment Company, formerly Co-op, when I went in there, right at eye level. So this is what you see. Does anyone want to?
Toronto is located on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeks, and the Wendake Neonwencio nations. The territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabes and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We thank them for caring for these lands and waters since the immemorial and are grateful to hike, climb, run, bike, ski, and paddle in these outdoor spaces.
Thanks, Sandra. So you can see that MEC has kind of personalized it in a way that I think is kind of fun and interesting. And I'm going to do one more, and this is the longest one. So any volunteers? This is from Pure Spirits Distillery, which is in the Distillery District.
We acknowledge that Pure Spirits, part of the Distillery Restaurant Corporation, in the Distillery District is located on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas, of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. The Distillery District is located on a pathway of water routes at the base of Lake Ontario. It's covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty between the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee and allied nations to share and steward the land with care. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We encourage our guests to join us in reflecting on their individual and collective relationships to this land, whether through settlement, immigration, displacement, and/or a combination of interrelated experiences. We also encourage our guests to inform themselves on the Indigenous and colonial histories of Toronto and treaty relationships. Lastly, we encourage our guests, teams, suppliers, partners, and extended communities to thoroughly read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 2015 report, 94 Calls to Action. As a restaurant group, event space, and cultural hub located on a designated heritage site, our organization pays specific attention to Call 92, Business and Reconciliation, Calls 69 to 70, Museums and Archives, and Calls 79 to 83, Commemoration.
Thank you, Philip. As you can tell, they went through some exercises to, fill out their land acknowledgements. You don't have to listen to something that long before you get to see the play that you went to see usually. But notice that the list of nations extends to the present, not just historically, like up to the time that settlers took over. It's very geographically precise, and that's considered appropriate. It contains an exhortation, which is optional, And you can tell it makes explicit attention to the TRC. It's a little bit above and beyond, I think, and they don't read it out loud. But that's an example of some of the things that can go into land acknowledgements. So now what I'm going to do is just go through some of the stuff that is in all of the land acknowledgements that's common to them, starting with the lists of the different Indigenous peoples that have been here. So in all of them, they talk about the Wendat. And I'm going to ask some questions, and by all means, feel free to unmute yourself if you know the answer to it. I'm going to try this and see if it works. But that is a link to and I'll send a resource like list. I didn't get it done in time for this morning, but I'll send one out you can go to that lists all of the traditional territories of Indigenous people all over the world. It's really interesting. So question number one, we talk about the Wendat. Does anybody know what the Wendat people used to be called? It is the Huron.
Oh,
Okay, sometimes they're still referred to as the Huron Wendat. They're not called the Huron anymore. Huron is a French name for that group of people, and it's a pejorative nickname referring to their hairstyle. We have Huron all over our maps of Ontario, but that was not the people's name for themselves. I'm not, so what Wendat means in the Wendat language is island dwellers. In the US, they call the Wyandot or Wyandot, if you're familiar with the US. So that's the Indigenous people's name, that group's name for themselves. So if you think of the Hurons, which you might have known about, first of all, it wasn't just one group of people or one person. It was a confederacy. So it was the Huron Confederacy. There was a number of different Iroquoian-speaking people, Iroquoian being the language group, with similar cultures and language. From what you know about the Huron people, what type of culture did they have? Does anyone know? So these are people who were agricultural, who lived in villages, in longhouses. They also did trading. If you've ever been to Ste. Marie among the Hurons, or if you've read the book The Orenda by Joseph Boyden, or if you've seen the movie Black Robe, that's the Huron people. During the fur trade, they were allied with the French, who insisted on them converting to Catholicism in order to provide them with weapons. And they were predominant in southern Ontario in the early 1600s. The Haudenosaunee, which is how you pronounce that word, Haudenosaunee, who used to live south of the Great Lakes, kind of incurred into the area and pushed them out in the mid 1600s. And they dispersed. Some of them went south to the States and others went over to Quebec. And so there is an official Wendat nation. It's got its own land and territory in Wendake, Quebec, which is north of Quebec City. You can go there and visit. Small place, as you can see, but it still exists. And how do we know that they lived in this, or that they were in this area of Toronto? Riverdale, right by Withrow Park Secondary School. When they were building the school in the 1890s, they discovered the remains of an Indigenous village there, which has been identified as what was called a Huron or Wendat village. And just this year, they were a construction company was doing some work on Withrow Avenue, and they dug up a burial site. So this work stopped, and there was some pauses while different groups were brought in to remove the remains there. So yes, they were here. There's any questions about them, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. So the land acknowledgements talk about the Wendat and then the Haudenosaunee. It's 4 syllables. Haudenosaunee. Like if you can say Elizabethan, you can say Haudenosaunee. And that is, does anyone know what they used to be called, the Haudenosaunee? You know them by the name Iroquois. which was a pejorative French nickname, possibly a pejorative French nickname, possibly derived from the pejorative nicknames that their enemies called them, and the French picked it up. But Iroquois is definitely a French name. It's sort of a French version of another name. So their name for themselves is Haudenosaunee. So we do them the respect by calling them the name that they call themselves instead of calling them a pejorative French nickname. And it means people of the longhouse. So these are the people who lived in villages, fortified villages in longhouses, and grew crops, grew corn, beans, and squash. Were a matriarchal society. Men did hunting, of course, but they were a settled agricultural people. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy refers to 5 nations who had lands in basically upstate New York, south of Lakes Ontario and Erie. I'm going to try and ream them off from memory. The Seneca, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Oneida. That's 5. And later a group called the Tuscarora joined them by the time they moved up to Ontario. They were agricultural, but they also engaged in the fur trade, and they were allies of the English. And as you remember, the English and the French were fighting. Therefore, the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee were also fighting or took advantage of the opportunity to ally themselves, people who were all the enemies of their enemies. They moved up into southern Ontario in the mid-1600s, engaged in war with the Wendat people, took over for a bit, established a presence in southern Ontario, but then they were pushed out by the Anishinaabe in the early 1700s. So they went back down to the United States. They were on the side of the British in the American Revolution, and they lost their lands, and of course, because they were on the losing side after the American Revolution. And so they came up here as loyalists, and they were granted land in southern Ontario. It's called the Haldimand Tract, a wide swath of land on either side of the Grand River. And it is now known as the Six Nations Reserve. It used to be a lot more land than it is now because some of it has been sold off for periods of time. And in Toronto, when the Haudenosaunee were here, they have found archaeological evidence out near Bobby Point, just north of Jane and Bloor, a village called Peagon. They found evidence, as you see, of a considerable village from the late 1600s, and there are records of French fur traders going up and down the Humber River, doing business with the Seneca Mohawk. So that's the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee people, and then the last group of people are the Anishinaabe. So it's Anishinaabe, who were the latest ones. Does anybody know what they used to be called? And going ahead, there's a long list of them. All of these people are part of the Anishinaabe people. So that's the Ojibwe, the Chippewa, the Odawa, Potawatomi, Algonquin, Saulteaux, Nipissing, Mississauga, and then some Oji-Cree and some Métis. And I don't know about those last 2, but the other ones I'm very familiar with those people. So it's a large group of people. The name Anishinaabe means original people or good people. They were not farming people like the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, and they spoke a different language, different culture, different means of living. They speak Anishinaabemowin is an Algonquian language, and the Anishinaabe originally migrated east from the East Coast, migrated west from the East Coast, and became dominant in a large area, basically north and south of the Great Lakes, the northern Great Lakes more, and onto the prairies. They were traders. They engaged in the fur trade, so they would trade with for instance, with the Wendat, and then the Wendat would trade with the French. Hunters, fishers, harvesters, and seasonally migrants. So they would live in different places within their territories according to where the food was available at a given time of year. So when the salmon were running, or when the wild rice was ready, or when the cranberries were ready to harvest, or during different seasons when it was easier to hunt game. They would move. Yeah, I mentioned that they were originally allied to the Wendat and engaged in wars with the Haudenosaunee and pushed them back into the States starting in the early 1700s, so that by the mid 1700s, which is when the British started to move into this area, this was the group that was dominant in this area. And they're found today in from Ontario and Manitoba and the Great Lakes states. And evidence that they live in Toronto area. Well, the Credit Village in Mississauga. I'm just going to show you a slide here. This is it doesn't look like much, but it is a little memorial garden on Mississauga Road near the entrance to the Mississauga Golf and Country Club, established in 2014. And it's on the site of the Credit Mission Village, which was an actual settled village that a group of Mississauga had between 1826 and 1847. So now that we're getting to Mississauga, we mention in our land acknowledgements the Mississaugas of the Credit. So Mississaugas of the Credit were or are, and sorry, please, I'm going to probably use the past tense more than is appropriate. So I'm going to correct myself, and if I don't correct myself, please correct me. Mississaugas of the Credit are an Anishinaabe people. This was the group who were dominant on the north shore of Lake Ontario, when the British came up looking to make treaties. So Mississauga, you can see that what there's different disagreements amongst Indigenous scholars of the language as to where it comes from. But one explanation is that it comes from this Minzazahi, meaning people who living where there are the mouths of many rivers. And one of their favorite creeks to fish in was called Missinihi Creek, where the French erected a trading post. And later they renamed it the Credit River because the Mississauga people that they were trading with, their credit was good. So the French knew that they would get, that they were willing to extend credit to them at the trading post because they knew that they would be promptly paid. This was the group that negotiated what we call the Toronto Purchase, which was the treaties of 1787 and 1805, which I'll get to in a bit. A group of them who lived right there on the Credit River, converted to Methodism in the early years of the 1800s because of a gentleman by the name of Peter Jones, settled in the Credit Village, which was there where the Mississauga Golf and Country Club is now, and prospered in that village, from 1826 to 1847, lovely little tidy village of log houses, and did all the things you're supposed to do. But by 1847, they had failed to get title to the land in that village. The British government wouldn't give them title to the land, and they were being encroached on by settlers and feared that the land would just be taken from them. So they arranged to relocate, and the Six Nations offered them land in their territory. Remember, the former adversaries, the Haudenosaunee, offered them a portion of their land. So they relocated there. So the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation is now in, it's just off the side of Highway 6, halfway between Brantford and Lake Erie, near Hagersville. It used to be called Mississaugas of the New Credit because it was a new place, and they changed the name within the last 10 years. This is the group that signed the treaty with the British, allowing the British to build the town of York and start giving land to settlers right here in Toronto. And so they're the ones who had the land claim. They disputed the treaty from the beginning in terms of the way the British conducted it. They launched various land claims over the years, and the latest one, which was initiated in 1986, was resolved in 2010. So we have only had a finalized treaty for this land for about 15 years. Wampums, the land acknowledgements mention wampum belts. So a wampum is a way of formalizing a treaty when you don't have a written form of language. And there were many, as you're aware, because of social studies in school, of conflicts between different groups. And when they came to agreements, they are also made treaties, but they were general agreements. And wampum belts were graphic representations. So it's a strip of hide on which is arranged quahog shells, which were clam shells from the East Coast, which were very valuable, that represented different concepts. There were also birch bark scrolls, pictographs, petroglyphs, masked totem poles, etc. So this idea of having a graphic representation of a treaty or agreement was well established by the time the settlers got here, and they took it up and engaged in making more wampums with the indigenous inhabitants of the area. So we'll take a look at two of them, and there's many more than the ones I'm covering here, but these are the ones that get mentioned a lot. So the first one mentioned in a lot of those land acknowledgements is the dish with one spoon. And this is a picture of it. You'll see lots of representations of it. There's some reproductions. So the dish, and I'm going to read you this from a resource called Talking Treaties, a resource guide for Torontonians, which I can send you a link to. An agreement grounded in Indigenous legal traditions, the dish with one spoon is one of several wampum that commemorate the relationship between the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Today it is held up by Indigenous peoples in Toronto as peace agreement between the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee. It is also widely cited and admired for the reciprocal responsibilities with all of creation that it foregrounds. A reading that draws on the land is a dish to be shared and cared for to ensure ongoing sustenance in life. So the dish, the land is the dish. We have a dish which provides us with the things that we need to live. A dish with one spoon means that we all share one spoon. And so it's a commitment to mutually live on and respect and care for the land which we inhabit. That's what this symbol is broadly interpreted to mean, especially these days when people put it in their land acknowledgements. And the next wampum that you should know about is called the two-row wampum. There's actually a pathway in that spirit garden in Nathan Phillips Square, which is it's called the two-row wampum pathway. And this is the Indigenous record of the first treaty. This is from the Onondaga Nation website that I'm reading. The Indigenous record of the first treaty between the Haudenosaunee people and Dutch settlers struck in the early 1600s, in 1613, per their oral records. It is what is known as a peace and friendship treaty. So what it shows, so imagine that the white field is a river, and there are two boats. The purple rows represent two boats, and notice that they are riding parallel to each other down the river. One of the purple strips stands for a Haudenosaunee canoe, and one stands for a settler ship, traveling in parallel down a river, each respecting and not interfering with the other. And it's based on three principles, which is peace and friendship, and that this is forever. So it's a treaty of, again, we're both here, we're sharing the land, we're going to respect each other and not interfere with one another. It's considered the basis of future treaties, including the 1764 Treaty of Niagara, where more than 2,000 chiefs renewed and extended a wampum that's called the Covenant Chain of Friendship, which was a multi-nation alliance between the Indigenous nations and the British Crown. And I haven't put that in because it's just presentation's long enough already. But the two-row wampum, you'll see referenced a lot. There's been a lot of recent movements, I guess, within Indigenous groups to sort of return to the principles of the two-row wampum. We're here, we'll share the land, we won't bother one another. And the last, I wanted to mention this, and then I'm going to, the Royal Proclamation. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 is a document that set out guidelines for European settlement of Indigenous territories in North America. It was initially issued by King George III 1763 to officially claim British territory in North America after Britain won the 7 Years' War. In the Royal Proclamation, ownership over North America is issued to King George. So you can see the map on the right-hand side, which comes from that Talking Treaties resource I mentioned. On the pink down along the Atlantic seaboard represents the 13 colonies. It's British colonies. And the British, of course, have just won a war with the French. So they've now taken Quebec. You can see up there, north of the Great Lakes. And then the area just south of James Bay, they have already given over Rupert's Land and the North and the Hudson Bay Company. So they claim that. They drew a line west of which the settlers in the US were not to cross. So they were not to go west of that line into what it calls Indian territory there. And they were not to engage individually with the Indigenous people for sale or transfer of land. It explicitly states that all land would be considered Aboriginal land until ceded by treaty. Proclamation forbade settlers from claiming land from the Aboriginal occupants unless it has first been bought, in quotes, by the Crown and then sold to the settlers. So the only people who can do business with the Indigenous people over land is the Crown. The Royal Proclamation further sets out that only the Crown can buy land from First Nations. Most Indigenous and legal scholars recognize the Royal Proclamation as an important first step toward the recognition of existing Aboriginal rights and title, including the right to self-determination. So what that means is, unless the Crown has entered into a treaty with a group of Indigenous people, it is assumed that the land that they are on is theirs and they have title to it. And that title has not been extinguished until it has been agreed to in a treaty. And the whole notion of extinguishment of title is a big, complicated legal issue today that I am not qualified to comment on. Notice the artwork there is from a really great website, which has the background of every single treaty that's been signed in Canada, called from the Yellowhead Institute at TMU. And this piece of art is the Royal Proclamation. It's sort of a picture of the actual document, and saying that it's ripped, demonstrating some of the violations of it. And it says, while the Royal Proclamation recognizes Indigenous rights and title in Canada and encourages the signing of nation-to-nation treaties, it was written without input from Indigenous people and was not created for our benefit. The ripped image represents the damage that colonial laws and broken treaties have caused, including our ability to fully access our territories and communities. The rips in the document are mended with beadwork, caribou tufting, and porcupine quills, showing the survival of our ancestors, our stories, and our cultures. So the Royal Proclamation, even though it was in 1763 in a specific instance, is still the bedrock of land claims and settlements today. And it's important to understand it and know something about it when it's mentioned. So the Toronto Purchase, or Treaty 13, same difference. The black and white map here, you can see right down at the very bottom. I'm just going to use the laser pointer right down here. So this is Toronto Island. Toronto Island's right here. This is a marsh that is now the Portlands, used to be a marsh. And this is the Humber River, which they called the carrying place. It was a means of getting up to portages and getting up to Lake Huron without having to go all the way through Lake Erie first. And it's the extent of what was called the Toronto Purchase in 1787. The one on the right is the current boundaries of Treaty 13 and all the other treaties within the municipal boundaries of Toronto. And you can see at the bottom the same Toronto Island, and actually you can see the Leslie Street spit on there too. And notice that the orange part on that map, that is Treaty 13 territory, the Toronto Purchase territory, over into Scarborough and parts of Markham and parts of Vaughan, and it's a different treaty. So if you live there, you have to learn a little bit of different information about the treaty. It's just sort of an extension of it. But it was negotiated in 1787 when John Johnson, the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for the government of Britain, held a council at the Bay of Quinte over by Trenton with the Anishinaabe. There he distributed gifts in recognition of their loyalty during the American Revolution and proposed the sale of lands near the carrying place at the mouth of the Humber River. While the Anishinaabe accepted these presents to confirm their ongoing alliance, the Crown interpreted them as a proof of payment for the land. But in the 1790s, colonial officials realized that the 1787, quote, surrender did not meet their own legal requirements for a treaty. The deed of sale that they drew up was blank. It didn't have specific boundaries, and it named the price. So not much good, really, as a deed of sale. Signatures of the Anishinaabe leaders were on an entirely separate sheet of paper, and the signatures were usually their drawings of the lands that they were the leaders of. Doubts about the validity of the first agreement and the region's growing importance led colonial officials to push for subsequent negotiations because they were worried that they'd be giving out land to settlers that they didn't rest on a secure legal foundation. In 1799, Peter Hunter became Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. He was so worried about the white settlers' ownership of the land at York that he directed a new deed be acquired from the Mississaugas. In response, the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs met formally with the Mississaugas at the Credit River in July of 1805. The Mississaugas agreed that John Johnson had purchased the land in 1787 with the understanding that the land at the mouth of the Etobicoke River was reserved for the Mississaugas' use as a fishery. The next day, a formal deed was prepared and signed, known as the Toronto Purchase. It described the area in question as just over 1,000 square kilometers, which included York. It called for a cash payment of 10 shillings, which is about $60 as of 2021, and the distribution of 2,000 gun flints, 24 brass kettles, 124 mirrors, 24 laced hats, 96 gallons of rum, and a bale of flowered flannel. Additionally, it included the sole use of the fishery at the mouth of the Etobicoke River for the Mississaugas. The size of this new purchase was several times larger than the 26 square kilometers that John Johnson remembered when questioned about the terms of the Johnson-Butler purchase. The Mississaugas always claimed that there was a discrepancy about the size of the land, and also that they had that list of things did not constitute payment, that they did not see that as payment for the land. In 1986, the Mississaugas initiated a claim against the Government of Canada over the 1805 Toronto Purchase. And on June, so that was an official federal land claims negotiation, which was resolved on June 8th, 2010. Parties involved reached a final compensatory agreement, resulting in a cash payment of $145 million to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Each of the 1,842 adult band members received a $20,000 cash payment, while the rest of the funds were put in trust. And the Yellowhead Institute points out that while the Mississauga continued to assert rights and some jurisdiction in Toronto, the city has also become home to the largest, most diverse Indigenous population in Canada, with some estimates suggesting that over 70,000 Indigenous people live and work in the city. Okay.
This land.
Yeah.
Is your
And
land is my land.
so this is a map of the town of York in 1817. Hang on. I presenter view. All right. You're seeing, whoa, sorry, I've got a white screen here and it's hard for me to control my arrows. You're seeing just the white screen in the map, right?
Yes, white screen in the map.
Okay. All right. So what I'm going to try and do is zoom in on. This is the town of York, 1817. If you see this, I'm going to. There's on the right-hand side, there's a big gray. Can you see my little hand moving, my cursor?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so you see this big gray ditch here? That doesn't exist. Well, it does exist, but it's underground now. That's Tattle Creek. And this pink street right here is King Street. And there's 5 blocks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, north and south of King Street. That's the town of York. It's already started to expand a little bit to the west. Over here, you see the blue that's coming down and coming out in two different places. That's the Don River coming out. And you see King Street goes along here. It takes a little bit of a turn. It goes over Tattle Creek, and then it goes up here and it becomes the Kingston Road. So it becomes the way to Kingston. And over here on the other side of Tattle Creek, which is now approximately, well, it flows underground, but Berkeley Street goes right up here now. And Parliament Street actually goes here now. But in 1817, all this is trees. Well, you can see it's little trees. And that was called the park, and it was government land. And the treaty, the Toronto Purchase Treaty, or the treaty with the Mississaugas, went as far as the Don River. So it went from the Humber River, the initial one, over to the Don River. So you can see that it went to the edge of the Don River. Now I'm going to zoom back out. If I can, there we go. And you can see that over here on the other side of the Don River is a big area. It was basically a wetland. It was a huge marsh. It was the largest marsh in eastern North America. And there was a peninsula, a sandbar coming out from it along the bottom that is now the Toronto Islands. Because in 1850, there was a huge storm that wiped out the connecting piece. But when the treaties were signed with the Mississaugas, it came all the way out here. And remember, the treaty was signed with them, the original one, up to the Don River, but not the other side of the Don River. So then this area down here could be interpreted to not have been included in that original treaty negotiation. Now we are looking at the city of Toronto in 1834. So it's not the town of York, it's become the city of Toronto, which it became in 1834. This is another map showing the harbor and everything, and you can see the wetland is really clearly shown. I'm going to zoom in right here. And you can see that there's a sandbar going down, and you can see the Don River is quite clear here. And notice how it bends. It hasn't been cut into a straight channel like it was in the 1890s. And it drains out about halfway down that marsh. And there's a sandbar that connects. And notice the little connecting pieces have been eroded away, and that would eventually get completely washed out. If you can see, there's a dotted line going across here where I'm moving a little hand. That is a line called the windmill line. So by 1834, that shows that the Gooderhams and Wortzes had arrived and they had built their windmill right down here at the distillery. The windmill line was a line between the Gooderham and Worts windmill and Fort Rouy, which was an old French fort, which was out there. And it was the line that they drew across the harbor, beyond which you could not build a jetty, so that it kept the harbor free for shipping. And notice that this little area here, this is still King Street, goes along. There's no more Tattle Creek because it started to get paved over. And the street bends north, King Street, and there's streets going up here and right around here. And remember, this is 1834. Right around here is where Little Trinity Church would be built. So it's within the lands covered by the Toronto Purchase and Treaty 13. It had been government land, as in the previous slide. And in 1830, the government decided that it was going to start subdividing it and selling parts of it per the rights that the government kept to itself in the Royal Proclamation, right? They treated for the land. It belonged to the government. When the government decided to portion it out, they did so, they sold it. That's basically how they settled Canada, pretty much. And including the land that Little Trinity got built on. So as of today, These are some of the Indigenous organizations that operate in our neighborhood. Anishinaabe Health Center, which this is a construction era photo on Cherry Street. Many of us have been involved in fundraising, going on walks, all that kind of thing to fund it. Anishinaabe Health is a large Indigenous-led social service organization. All of these are large Indigenous-led, well-established, nonprofit social service organizations that are operating in our area. So Anishinaabe is going to be, they've had a soft opening, like they're actually using the space, but they're not quite finished, so they haven't had a grand opening yet. They are relocating their facilities from 3 different places all over Toronto to be here. The next place is just north of Anishinaabe Health. Again, still a bit of a construction site. This is going to be the headquarters of Miziri Beek, which is an employment agency, an Indigenous employment agency, currently located on Gerrard Street. Down at the bottom is that building is called Berkeley Castle. It's on the corner of Esplanade and Berkeley. Doesn't look very castle-like in this picture, but it's got a nice courtyard that looks castle-y. And the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, formerly known as the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, is located there. And they exist to help Aboriginal businesses and to help non-Aboriginal businesses do business with Aboriginal businesses. And they just changed their name from Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business to Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. Then, right, this is a place that at least one of us knows. This is a building in the West Donlands. It's operated by an organization called Wigwaman, which is an Indigenous housing provider. They have many different sites around Toronto, and they have a partnership also with the March of Dimes, so that some of the units in that building are available to people through the March of Dimes. And this is right on the corner of Front and Rolling Mills Road, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Front and Cooperage Street.
Cooperage Street, Rolling Mills is one down. Okay, thanks, Adam. And then on Front Street, right across the street from the No Frills, front and beside the fire hall near Princess, is the offices of the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres. So Indigenous Friendship Centres, formerly known as Indian Friendship Centres, started to get established in different cities around Ontario in the 50s, and they were for people, Indigenous people who found their way in cities instead of on their reserves. And they were basically community centers, social service centers, sort of all-purpose places for urban Indigenous people to gather. And so there are many of them, and they have a federation that works on behalf of all of them. And their offices are located right there on Front Street in a heritage building with this really nice mural by Joseph Sagaj on the side of it. And then just north of us on Parliament and Dundas is Council Fire Native Cultural Center, another very large Indigenous social service organization. They have quite a wide range of services that they offer. They're for seniors, youth, shelter, food program, and they are the organization that was one of the main movers and coordinated the installation and the founding of the Spirit Garden commemorative site in Nathan Phillips Square. Also in our neighborhood, there has been an effort, the Waterfront Toronto is engaged in doing Indigenous placemaking, which is kind of being obvious about Indigenous presence in certain areas. So 2 public art initiatives that they funded and did a curated competition for. One of them is in construction. This one is right outside of Anishinaabe Health at the corner of Cherry and Mill, called In Equilibrium, and it's by an artist named Ludovic Boni. If you go to it and you're supposed to look up, but there's a mirror up at the top, and his idea is that you look up at it and you're also looking back down. You're looking at the sky. You're looking back down, and I don't know what they're made of, but the things that are hanging there looked from the other side, look like cattails and stuff. The other thing that's supposed to be, that is not yet done, but that is going to be the anchor on the other side of the West Don Lands area, is that little triangle where King and Queen and River meet. So, you know, King and Queen kind of join each other, and then River goes north-south, and there's this little triangle of wasteland. And an Indigenous pair have been contracted to do placemaking on that site. And this is an illustration of what it's going to look like. It's supposed to commemorate the flood control measures that are being done in Corktown Common and down at the Portlands. And I don't know if you can see right in the middle, there's like an overturned kind of lime green, lime yellow canoe. And it's going to recall Indigenous people landing their canoes. And then there's an orange sculpture over on the far left side that are going to be like playful little figures there. And they're going to do Indigenous plantings and make it like a nice little place where you can go and sit and have a coffee and walk your dog. The image to the side of it is in Brookfield Place. And I just put it in there because one of the artists that's going to be doing this work at King, Queen, and River is a guy named Jordan Bennett. And I saw this installation when they had it up in Brookfield Place a few years ago, and it was stunning. He's a Mi'kmaq artist, and that's the work he does. So that made me feel optimistic about the quality of what's going to go on at that little King, Queen, and River Park. Placemaking names. I tried to put animations here so that I could have you guess what the names are and then bring up the meaning, and it didn't work. I couldn't get it to work because it was in a chart. But anyways, Toronto, and this is the Toronto. It's a Mohawk name. So if you see that, it's referring to the actual Mohawk word from which the English word Toronto is, where there are trees standing in the water, which refers to fishing weirs up at the Narrows, where Lake Simcoe flows into the Wichiching Narrows, where there was basically a fishing weirs. And that's what the Haudenosaunee people that the French were trading with called that area up at the top of the Humber River. And since the Humber River, which was called the carrying place, was the primary kind of highway at the time, the name Toronto got to refer to the whole waterway, and then it got to refer to the whole area. So that's where it comes from, where there are trees standing in the water. It's fishing weirs up in Lake Simcoe. Etobicoke comes from Anishinaabe, or Anishinaabe-Moan is the name of the language of the Anishinaabe people. And Etobicoke is a version of that other name there, Wadubikang. And it means the place where the alders grow. So that might be interesting to know. Notice that the Indigenous names are really kind of sensible, like they're just basically descriptive. You might, if you're driving along Eastern Avenue and you pass Coxwell, notice that on the north side, it's called Coxwell. And on the south side, it's not called Lower Coxwell anymore. It's called Mdabimok, which means where the road goes to the water. So it was renamed. The city was going to rename it, and they took the opportunity to give it an Indigenous name in acknowledgement of Indigenous pathway that used to be there. Villiers Island, I'm going to show pictures of these in a minute, but it was in the news last week that Indigenous names had been chosen. There's a council of Indigenous elders that the city works with in terms of a number of things, but one of them is Indigenous place names. And they had decided that the Indigenous name for Villiers Island should be Ukwamin Minising, which means place of the black cherry trees. And they found out that, unbeknownst to them, for a couple of years now, some of the people from parks, as they were creating the area, had been planting black cherry trees, which are Indigenous to the area. So it was considered to be kind of like a kismet kind of moment where, you know, both sides were thinking the same way. And parks in the Portlands the Indigenous name is going to be Bidasige, which means sunlight shining towards us. It's the most fanciful of names there. This is a picture of the Ukwemin or aka Villiers Island, the place of the black cherry trees, showing how the area that they're now creating in the Portlands at the bottom of Cherry Street is going to be able to future flood events. So it says regulatory flood event at the bottom because this is how it will look if there's a flood. Instead of the Don River getting backed up and flooding onto the Don Valley Parkway so that people have to stop their cars and stand there in the middle of the Don Valley Parkway until the waters go down. It's designed to accommodate a flood event so that the entire downtown of the city doesn't flood. And when the waters go down, all that's down there, it's the renaturalizing of the mouth of the Don. So if you think of the pictures I showed in the earlier slides where the mouth of the Don came down a little bit and then made a natural turn, that's what they've tried to restore in that massive earthworks project that is still ongoing. And they just last week pulled out the last stop, which was right here at the mouth of the harbor, so that the Don River is now flowing all the way into the harbor, and it's close to its original route. And these are just a few pictures from the many, many, many that are on the Waterfront Toronto Portlands website. I chose one showing one of the new super cool bridges because the name Idasige, sunlight shining towards us, the bridges are in colors of the sunrise, orange, red, and yellow. And it shows you some of the parks that are there and the people riding their bikes. And then this is one of the playgrounds. It's going to be an outdoor playground. And to me, that looks like where the trees stand in the water. So that Toronto thing with the beavers running all over it, kind of nice and playful. One of the playgrounds under construction. And I am going to, you know what? I'm just going to skip by some of these slides and go right to the end. And then I can go back to them if you want. So a lot of people, when they find out or start to become aware of what happened, for instance, with the residential schools and the treaties, I've gone to so many events where somebody stands up and says, so what do I do as an individual? And this is what I have been told over and over again and heard over and over again. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that dealt with the impact and the aftermath of the residential schools. And what Indigenous people say all the time is don't go rushing into reconciliation, start with the truth. So learn the history. Listen to the Indigenous people's viewpoints and do the work to understand the issues. It's a lot of work because most of us were not taught it in school. And another thing is one of those land acknowledgements referenced the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. When I took my first course on this journey that I've been on, it was about that. It was about the TRC report and the 94 calls to action. And I went through them all because everyone said, oh, you should know, you should follow them. None of them are calls to individual action. They're all calls for organizations to take action. So I couldn't find something that I as an individual could do and say, I'm fulfilling TRC call to action number X. Most of them are addressed to the federal government. Many of them are addressed to provincial governments. Some are addressed to businesses and churches and other entities. And so what I've come to is that what we as citizens are asked to do is to hold those who are called on to do those 94 calls to action responsible or accountable. Find out what was the federal government asked to do. There's a lot of things having to do with everything from funding education to funding child welfare to even before the 2021 discovery of the unmarked graves to providing better burial records. There's a lot of things that those entities have been called on to do. So if we're members of any of those things, we can become familiar with what's in the calls to action. And as citizens or members, hold those people accountable. And then the other thing is to support Indigenous-led organizations. So there's a lot of projects on for language revitalization, for healing, for health, for education, like the organizations that I showed you the pictures of their buildings in our neighborhood. There are businesses, Indigenous businesses you can support. You can support Indigenous cultural products. Native Earth Performing Arts is located in the Daniel Spectrum Center on Dundas Street in Regent Park. I went to a play there last year. They produce really good theater. There's music and art. There are athletics that you can, go and support. And supporting causes and charities with donations, obviously, or action. For instance, there was a march in Toronto called the River Run, which runs every year, and it's to raise awareness for the mercury contamination in Grassy Narrows in Northern Ontario and the various things that are going on there. Caused a bit of a controversy this year when a Palestinian protest also showed up and people had been pulled out of school to go to the march, and there was a bit of a controversy, but that doesn't mean that the cause that the River Run March is supporting is less worthy of support. And then the other thing I've also heard is amplify Indigenous voices. So Indigenous culture and political organization is alive and well and healthy, and doesn't need me to go talking on behalf of Indigenous people. But if I have a platform, then I can amplify Indigenous voices, then that's an appropriate thing for me to do as a non-Indigenous person. I am going to stop it there.